When we begin to understand why a narcissist will sleep with almost anybody, we have to start with something far more vulnerable than most people expect. We have to begin with pain. Not obvious pain, not tears or visible suffering, but the quiet buried ache of not feeling enough. At the center of narcissistic behavior is an overwhelming hunger for validation. And I use the word hunger deliberately because it behaves like hunger. It feels urgent. It feels physical. It demands to be fed. For someone with strong narcissistic traits, attention is not pleasant. It is regulating. Admiration is not flattering. It is stabilizing. Desire from another person becomes emotional oxygen. When someone wants them sexually, something powerful happens internally. The nervous system lights up. The self-doubt quiets. The old shame softens, at least for a moment. That look of desire says, "You matter. You are special. You are chosen." And if deep down they have never truly believed those things about themselves, that external confirmation becomes intoxicating. This is not about high libido. It is not about healthy sexual expression. It is about using another human being as a mirror to reflect back worth. Many people assume narcissism is about arrogance, but clinically and psychologically, what often lies underneath is a fragile sense of self. In discussions around modern narcissistic culture, such as those explored in the narcissism epidemic, we see how inflated self-presentation can coexist with deep insecurity. Grandiosity and shame are not opposites. They are partners. One protects against the other. So, when a narcissist sleeps with someone, especially someone new, they are not primarily pursuing intimacy. They are pursuing reassurance. The conquest itself becomes evidence. If this person desires me, I must be valuable. And the more desirable the partner appears, the stronger the temporary high. But here is the tragedy. Validation that comes from outside never repairs what was wounded inside. Often, if we trace this pattern backward, we find early relational experiences where love was conditional. Perhaps the child was praised for performance but not comforted in distress. Perhaps they were admired for achievement but unseen in vulnerability. Or perhaps they were shamed, criticized, or emotionally neglected. In such environments, a child learns something dangerous. I am worthy only when I impress. I am lovable only when I perform. Sex, later in life, becomes the ultimate performance. It is immediate. It is intense. It provides rapid feedback. The other person's attraction becomes applause, and applause can be addictive. When we talk about addiction, we usually think of substances, but the mechanism is the same. There is an internal discomfort, anxiety, emptiness, shame. There is a behavior that temporarily relieves that discomfort. In this case, sexual validation. The relief reinforces the behavior. Over time, the person needs more frequent or more intense experiences to achieve the same effect. So when you see someone who seems able to sleep with anybody, it is not necessarily because they feel powerful. It may be because they cannot tolerate the quiet moments when no one is affirming them. Silence becomes threatening. Solitude becomes unbearable. Without someone reflecting admiration back to them, they may feel invisible, or worse, defective. And this is where people in relationships with narcissistic individuals become confused and deeply hurt. They think, if I love them, why isn't that enough? But the issue is not the partner's adequacy. It is the narcissist's internal void. One person's steady love cannot compete with a lifetime of unaddressed shame. And so the search continues. New faces, new bodies, new confirmations. There is also something important to understand about the speed of sexual validation. Emotional intimacy takes time. It requires vulnerability, honesty, mutuality. Sexual attraction, however, can be immediate. It offers instant proof of desirability. For someone starving for reassurance, that immediacy is incredibly seductive. And yet, because the validation is external, it fades quickly. After the encounter, the old feelings return. The self-doubt creeps back in. The admiration is no longer fresh. So the nervous system begins searching again. Another partner, another affirmation, another hit. If we view this through a compassionate lens, not an excusing one, we begin to see the underlying wound. The behavior may be harmful, it may betray trust, it may devastate partners, but underneath destructive behavior is dysregulation. Underneath exploitation is insecurity. Underneath compulsive validation seeking is a child who once did not feel securely loved. Adults are accountable for their actions, but understanding the roots allows us to move beyond moral judgment and into psychological clarity. When someone equates being desired with being worthy, they are trapped in a fragile system. Their value fluctuates depending on who wants them today. Aging becomes terrifying. Rejection becomes catastrophic. Criticism feels annihilating. Because if worth depends on admiration, then any loss of admiration feels like the loss of self. Healthy self-esteem, in contrast, is internalized. It is not dependent on how many people desire you. It does not collapse when attention fades. It is grounded in a stable sense of being inherently enough. But if that foundation was never built in childhood, the adult may spend decades trying to construct it through other people's eyes. So when we ask why a narcissist might sleep with almost anybody, the deeper answer is this: they are not chasing bodies. They are chasing worth. They are pursuing pleasure. They are pursuing relief. They are not demonstrating strength. They are compensating for fragility. And the more empty they feel inside, the more urgent the pursuit becomes. The tragedy is that each encounter moves them further away from the very thing they truly need: authentic connection. Because real connection requires showing the insecure self, the doubtful self, the wounded self. And that feels far more dangerous than seeking another admirer. So instead of healing the wound, they manage it. Instead of facing shame, they anesthetize it. Instead of building inner worth, they harvest outer approval. But no amount of desire from others can fill a hole created by early emotional deprivation. If we want to break this cycle, whether in ourselves or in someone we care about, the work is not about policing behavior. It is about addressing the underlying shame. It is about cultivating self-compassion. It is about learning that worth is not earned through conquest, but discovered through awareness. Because the endless search for validation is not a sign of confidence. It is a cry for love that was never fully received. Now, once we understand that validation acts like a drug, the next layer becomes clearer. For many narcissistic individuals, sex is not only about feeling valued, it is about feeling powerful. And power for someone who once felt powerless can become just as intoxicating as admiration. When a narcissist sleeps with somebody, especially someone who is already committed, emotionally invested, or otherwise hard to get, it is often experienced internally as a victory, not a mutual experience, not shared intimacy, a victory. There is a conquest mentality that can develop when early life experiences created a deep sense of helplessness. If a child grows up in an environment where they felt controlled, criticized, neglected, or emotionally unseen, they adapt. Children cannot escape their circumstances, so they develop psychological strategies to survive them. One such strategy is to build a false sense of superiority, a protective shell that says, "I will never be small again. I will never be at someone else's mercy again." But protection easily turns into domination. Sex then becomes a stage upon which power dynamics are played out. If I can attract you, seduce you, make you desire me, I am in control. If I can make you break your boundaries for me, I am superior. If I can have access to you without giving you emotional access to me, I hold the upper hand. You begin to see that this is not about connection at all. It is about control. In trauma-informed perspectives, including those articulated by Gabor Maté, we understand that many adult behaviors are adaptations to childhood wounds. When a person once felt emotionally powerless, they may later seek environments where they feel dominant. Sexual conquest becomes one of the fastest ways to create that sensation, because sexual attraction triggers vulnerability in others. When someone desires you, they soften, they lean in, they open. For a narcissistic personality, that opening can be experienced not as something to cherish, but as something to leverage. The vulnerability of the other person becomes evidence of influence, and influence feels like safety. You see, if I am the one who leaves first, I cannot be abandoned. If I am the one controlling the emotional distance, I cannot be hurt. If I reduce intimacy to physical access, I never have to expose my own fragility. There is also something neurologically reinforcing about power. Dominance activates reward circuits in the brain. Being chosen repeatedly confirms status. And for someone whose identity is built on superiority rather than secure self-worth, status becomes everything. This is why you may observe a pattern. Once the chase is over, once the person is emotionally hooked, the narcissist often loses interest. The goal was not closeness. The goal was to win. In some cases, the act of sleeping with anybody is not even about attraction. It is about proof. Proof that they can. Proof that they still have it. Proof that they remain desirable. But layered into that proof is another message. I decide. I control. I dominate. And underneath that drive for dominance is fear. Because genuine intimacy requires equality. It requires mutual influence. It requires sometimes not being in control. For someone who associates vulnerability with humiliation or rejection, equality feels dangerous. Power feels safer. So rather than risking a relationship where needs must be expressed and boundaries respected, they create dynamics where they maintain emotional leverage. They may even unconsciously seek partners who are highly empathetic, forgiving, or insecure themselves, people more likely to tolerate imbalance. When such partners remain attached despite betrayal, it further reinforces the narcissist's sense of control. Even after I hurt you, you stay. That means I hold power. But this dynamic is profoundly unhealthy, not only for the partner, but for the narcissistic individual as well. Because relationships built on power cannot provide nourishment. They cannot offer the healing that early wounds require. They only recreate the very instability that shaped the wound in the first place. There is another important layer here. Sometimes narcissistic sexual behavior escalates when the individual feels threatened. Perhaps they experience criticism. Perhaps they sense emotional distance. Perhaps they fear aging, failure, or loss of status. In those moments, sleeping with someone new becomes a way to restore dominance quickly. It says, I am still in control. I am still desired. I am still superior. Power obtained through exploitation does not create security. It creates more anxiety, because it must constantly be maintained. And so the cycle continues. You may notice that in many of these situations, empathy is minimized. The other person's feelings become secondary to the narcissist's need to feel strong. That is why betrayal can occur so easily. It is not that they always consciously intend to cause harm. It is that their nervous system is prioritizing self-protection over mutual care. When early development did not teach safe connection, the adult may confuse dominance with safety. Yet true safety does not come from overpowering another human being. It comes from internal regulation. It comes from knowing that you are worthy even when you are not admired, even when you are not desired, even when you are not winning. And this is where healing would need to occur. The work is not about suppressing sexuality. It is not about moral condemnation. It is about addressing the unresolved trauma that equates vulnerability with danger. Because as long as power feels safer than connection, the person will continue to seek situations where they feel on top rather than seen. And let me say this clearly. The more someone needs to dominate in order to feel secure, the less secure they actually are. Power that must constantly be proven is not strength. It is compensation. When sex becomes a tool for control, intimacy dies. When conquest replaces connection, relationships become battlegrounds. And when dominance substitutes for self-worth, no number of partners will ever bring peace. Real strength is the ability to be vulnerable without collapsing. Real confidence is the capacity to connect without controlling. Real intimacy is mutual, not hierarchical. Until someone learns that, they will continue mistaking power for love. And power has never healed a wounded heart. If we go even deeper now, beneath the need for validation and beneath the drive for power, we come to something far more uncomfortable: emotional emptiness. And this is the piece that people rarely see. They see the charm, they see the confidence, they see the sexual boldness. What they don't see is the hollow space inside that all of it is trying to cover. Emotional emptiness does not feel dramatic. It doesn't always feel like sadness. Often it feels like numbness, a flatness, a quiet sense that something essential is missing. For many individuals with strong narcissistic adaptations, this emptiness began early, when a child's emotional needs are not consistently met. When attunement, warmth, and unconditional presence are absent, the child learns to disconnect from their own vulnerable feelings. Because feeling unmet needs hurts. So the psyche does something brilliant for survival. It shuts certain feelings down. It builds defenses. It creates a version of the self that can function without needing too much. Over time, that defensive self becomes the dominant identity. Outwardly, it may appear confident, even magnetic. Inwardly, however, there is often a profound disconnection from authentic emotion. Now here is where sexuality enters the picture. Sex is one of the fastest ways to feel something intensely. It activates the body, it stimulates dopamine, it produces excitement, novelty, anticipation. For someone who feels chronically empty or numb, that intensity, why can feel like aliveness. It cuts through the flatness. And so sleeping with someone new is not only about validation or control, it is about escaping the void. When the internal world feels dull or unbearable, external stimulation becomes a coping mechanism. In trauma-informed psychology, something deeply explored in works like In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, we understand that addictive behaviors are not about pleasure. They are about relief. The behavior soothes or distracts from an underlying discomfort. In this case, the discomfort is emptiness. Many narcissistic individuals cannot sit quietly with themselves for long periods. Stillness may bring up old feelings, shame, loneliness, worthlessness, emotions that were never safely processed in childhood. Instead of turning inward with compassion, they turn outward for stimulation. A new body, a new admirer, a new rush, and for a brief moment the emptiness fades, but only for a moment. Because the sexual encounter does not address the root wound, it does not restore the lost connection to self. It does not teach emotional regulation. It simply overlays intensity onto numbness. And when the intensity fades, as it inevitably does, the emptiness returns, sometimes stronger than before. This creates a cycle that looks impulsive from the outside, but feels compulsive from the inside. You might ask, why not seek emotional intimacy instead? Why not build a deep connection with one person? The answer is that emotional intimacy requires presence with one's own feelings. It requires vulnerability. And for someone who learned early that vulnerability led to pain, exposure feels threatening. Numbness feels safer than rejection. Surface-level excitement feels safer than deep emotional risk. So they may move from partner to partner, not because they are fulfilled, but because they are trying to outrun an internal silence. There is also another dynamic at play. Emotional emptiness often coexists with chronic boredom. When a person is disconnected from their authentic self, life can feel unstimulating. Ordinary routines feel dull. Stability feels suffocating. Novel sexual experiences inject drama, excitement, unpredictability. Chaos can feel preferable to quiet emptiness. This is why you may see patterns of escalating behavior. What once provided stimulation no longer suffices. The nervous system adapts. More novelty is required. More risk. More intensity. From the outside, it may look reckless. From the inside, it feels necessary. And yet, every time a relationship is reduced to physical access, the deeper longing for genuine connection remains unmet. The emptiness is not filled by bodies. It is filled by emotional attunement, by authenticity, by the experience of being known and accepted without performance. But if someone has built their entire identity around image superiority or control, stepping into authenticity feels destabilizing. Who am I without the mask? Who am I without admiration? Who am I if I slow down? Those questions can feel terrifying. So instead of asking them, the person seeks distraction. It is important to understand that emotional emptiness is not a moral failing. It is often the echo of unmet developmental needs. A child who did not receive consistent emotional mirroring may grow into an adult who does not fully feel themselves. But while the wound may not be their fault, healing it becomes their responsibility. Without healing, the cycle continues. Sleep with someone, feel alive, feel powerful, feel validated, then feel empty again. Repeat. And meanwhile, partners are hurt, trust is broken, relationships fracture. The narcissistic individual may even feel brief remorse, but remorse without self-exploration rarely leads to change. Instead, shame may increase, and shame deepens emptiness, which then fuels the next escape. It becomes a self-perpetuating loop. If you listen carefully to someone caught in this pattern, beneath the bravado you may hear something softer. A fear of being alone. Not physically alone, emotionally alone. Alone with their own thoughts, alone with unresolved pain. Real healing would require slowing down enough to feel that pain, to grieve what was missing, to recognize the early adaptations that once ensured survival but now sabotage intimacy. But slowing down is the very thing the emptiness resists. So what is the alternative? The alternative is learning to tolerate internal discomfort without immediately anesthetizing it. It is building emotional awareness gradually. It is cultivating relationships where vulnerability is not punished. It is developing a sense of worth that is not dependent on stimulation. Because here is the truth. Emptiness cannot be filled from the outside. It can only be understood from the inside. No number of partners can substitute for self-connection. No intensity can replace intimacy. No conquest can heal neglect. And until someone is willing to sit quietly with their own emptiness, not run from it, not seduce over it, not dominate through it, they will continue mistaking distraction for fulfillment. But distraction is not healing, and you cannot outrun a void that lives within you. As we continue unfolding this pattern, we arrive at something that is often misunderstood and frequently oversimplified: empathy. People will say they have no empathy, but psychologically it's more nuanced than that. It's not always that empathy is completely absent. Often, it is underdeveloped, selectively activated, or overridden by self-protective mechanisms. When we talk about narcissistic personality structures in clinical terms, as outlined in the Agnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, one of the defining features is interpersonal exploitation, using others to meet one's own needs without sufficient regard for their feelings. That doesn't necessarily mean the person is incapable of understanding emotions. It often means their survival strategies consistently take priority over relational attunement. Now think about what that means in the context of sexuality. If I am primarily focused on regulating my own insecurity, feeding my need for validation, maintaining power, or escaping emptiness, then your emotional experience becomes secondary. Not because I consciously wake up wanting to harm you, but because my nervous system is oriented towards self-preservation. Empathy requires space. It requires emotional capacity. It requires being regulated enough internally to hold another person's feelings without becoming overwhelmed or threatened. But when someone is operating from chronic insecurity or shame, their inner world is already consuming most of their psychological bandwidth. In that state, other people can easily become instruments rather than individuals. When a narcissistic individual sleeps with someone casually, especially if that person is emotionally invested, there is often a compartmentalization that occurs. They may understand intellectually that the other person has feelings, but emotionally, they disconnect from the impact. They minimize it. They rationalize it. They knew what this was. It's not that serious. Everyone does it. These narratives protect the ego from guilt. And guilt, for someone already carrying deep shame, can feel intolerable. So instead of processing remorse in a healthy way, they suppress empathy to avoid further destabilization. There's also something developmental here. Empathy is nurtured in childhood through attuned caregiving. When a parent cons, instantly mirrors a child's emotional experience. I see you're sad. That must have hurt. I'm here. The child learns both to feel their own emotions safely and to recognize emotions in others. But if emotional attunement was inconsistent or absent, that skill may not fully develop. In some cases, children who grow up in emotionally chaotic environments must focus intensely on reading others for survival, but not in a way that fosters compassion. It fosters hypervigilance. They learn to detect moods to avoid punishment or rejection. That's cognitive awareness. not necessarily empathic connection. So later in life, they may be quite skilled at identifying what someone wants or needs, but they use that information strategically, not relationally. This is why narcissistic individuals can sometimes appear incredibly attentive at the beginning of a relationship. They study you. They notice your vulnerabilities, your longings, your insecurities, and they respond in ways that make you feel deeply seen. But the seeing is functional. It serves attraction. It serves bonding. It serves control. Once the bond is secured, the empathic engagement often fades. Now, in the context of sexual behavior, limited empathy allows for repeated betrayals without sustained emotional disruption. If I can disconnect from your pain, I can continue my behavior. If I can convince myself that your hurt is exaggerated, I don't have to confront my impact. And here's something important. When shame is overwhelming, empathy often collapses. Because to truly feel another person's pain would activate unbearable self-judgment. So the psyche protects itself by narrowing its focus to self-interest. This is not an excuse. It is an explanation. In healthy relationships, empathy creates restraint. When you genuinely feel the emotional reality of another human being, you naturally hesitate before harming them. You consider consequences. You feel discomfort at the idea of betrayal. Empathy acts as an internal regulator. Without that regulator, impulses dominate. And so sleeping with anybody becomes easier. The internal brake system is weak. The focus remains on immediate gratification, validation, power, stimulation, rather than long-term relational integrity. But here's the paradox. Beneath the limited empathy often lies a deep hunger to be understood. Many narcissistic individuals desperately want others to empathize with them. They crave validation for their own pain, their own struggles, their own insecurities. Yet offering that same attunement outward feels threatening or exhausting. It's a one-way bridge. And over time, this creates relational devastation. Partners feel unseen, used, disposable. They may question their worth. They may internalize blame. Meanwhile, the narcissistic individual may genuinely not comprehend the depth of harm they've caused. Or if they do, they quickly defend against it. Because facing the full impact would require confronting the original wound, the part of them that once felt invisible. Empathy, when developed, requires courage. It requires tolerating discomfort. It requires acknowledging that our actions affect others. For someone whose entire structure is built around avoiding vulnerability, this can feel destabilizing. Yet without empathy, intimacy is impossible. Sex without empathy becomes transaction. Relationship without empathy becomes performance. Commitment without empathy becomes control. And here is the deeper tragedy. When someone repeatedly overrides empathy, they reinforce their own isolation. They may have many partners. They may experience constant attention, but they remain fundamentally alone. Because true connection is built on mutual emotional recognition. If you cannot truly feel another person, you cannot truly be felt either. Healing in this area would mean strengthening emotional awareness slowly and safely. It would mean developing the capacity to sit with guilt without collapsing into shame. It would mean recognizing that acknowledging harm does not annihilate the self. It humanizes it. But until that work happens, the pattern continues. Desire pursued without consideration. Connection simulated without depth. Bodies encountered without emotional presence. And the absence of empathy becomes the silent engine driving it all. If you remove empathy from intimacy, what remains is consumption. And no one has ever been nourished by consuming another human being. As we move further into this exploration, we arrive at something that may seem contradictory at first. The person who appears sexually fearless is often deeply afraid of real intimacy. On the surface, they seem bold, uninhibited, even adventurous. But when we look more closely, we see that what they avoid is not sex. It is closeness. There is a profound difference between physical access and emotional intimacy. Physical access requires attraction, opportunity, and willingness. Emotional intimacy requires vulnerability, transparency, and mutual trust. For someone with strong narcissistic adaptations, the second is far more threatening than the first. If early relationships taught you that being vulnerable leads to rejection, humiliation, or neglect, you learn to protect yourself. You may not consciously remember the original injuries, but your nervous system does. It remembers the sting of not being soothed, the ache of not being seen, the fear of being criticized when you are already hurting. So you construct a self that cannot be easily wounded. That constructed self can flirt, it can seduce, it can impress, it can dominate, but it cannot safely expose uncertainty, insecurity, or NED, because those states feel dangerous. This is why promiscuity can coexist with profound intimacy avoidance. Sleeping with someone does not require revealing your authentic fears. It does not require sharing your shame. It does not require admitting that you feel unworthy or anxious or lonely. It only requires performance. And performance is familiar territory. When someone says, a narcissist will sleep with anybody, what they often mean is that there seems to be no emotional barrier. But in truth, there is a massive emotional barrier. It simply exists beneath the surface. The barrier prevents depth, not contact. True intimacy is destabilizing for someone who has built their identity around control and image. In an intimate bond, you cannot fully curate how you are seen. Over time, your partner notices your insecurities. They see your flaws. They witness your moods. The illusion of perfection cannot be perfectly maintained. And if your self-worth depends on appearing superior, that exposure feels intolerable. So instead of staying in relationships long enough to be deeply known, you move on. You seek novelty. New partners do not yet see the cracks. With them, you can reset the image. You can be admired again without the risk of being truly understood. In psychological discussions about attachment and trauma, perspectives that have been thoughtfully articulated by Gabor Maté, we see how early emotional injuries shape adult relational patterns. If closeness once led to pain, the adult may unconsciously recreate distance even while consciously claiming to want connection. It's not hypocrisy, it's conditioning. You may hear someone with narcissistic traits speak passionately about wanting love, commitment, loyalty, and they may genuinely believe it. But when intimacy deepens, anxiety rises. The closer someone gets, the more likely they are to trigger old fears. What if they see who I really am? What if they leave? What if I am not enough? Rather than tolerate that anxiety, it feels safer to destabilize the relationship first. Infidelity, casual encounters, emotional withdrawal. These behaviors reestablish distance. They restore a sense of autonomy. They reduce vulnerability. And paradoxically, they protect against the very abandonment they fear. Because if I never attach, I can never be fully left. But this strategy comes at a cost. Every time intimacy is avoided, the underlying wound remains untouched. Every time a partner is replaced instead of trusted, the opportunity for corrective emotional experience disappears. Growth requires staying. Healing requires tolerating discomfort. Intimacy requires risk. For someone whose nervous system equates vulnerability with danger, that risk feels unbearable. There is also something else at play. Deep intimacy requires empathy, accountability, and mutual regulation. It requires saying, I hurt you, and staying present to repair. It requires hearing criticism without collapsing into rage or shame. It requires admitting need. But narcissistic defenses are built precisely to avoid those states. Grandiosity protects against shame. Control protects against fear. Seduction protects against insecurity. So instead of deepening, relationships often remain shallow, intense but not grounded, passionate but not secure. And here is the irony. Many individuals caught in this pattern feel profoundly alone. They may have numerous sexual experiences, yet lack a single relationship where they feel fully accepted. Because acceptance requires authenticity. And authenticity requires dismantling the protective mask. That dismantling feels like psychological death. So they cling to what feels safer. Novelty over depth, admiration over understanding, excitement over stability. If you have ever been in a relationship with someone like this, you may have felt confused. In the beginning, they seemed deeply engaged, attentive, passionate, almost soulmate-like. But as time passed and emotional closeness increased, something shifted. Distance appeared. Impulsivity surfaced. Perhaps betrayal occurred. It wasn't that the initial connection was entirely fake. It was that sustained intimacy triggered fear. The more you mattered, the more dangerous it felt. Until this fear is addressed consciously, the cycle will continue. New partners will be pursued not because they are better, but because they are safer. They do not yet hold the power to truly wound. Real love requires surrender. Not surrender of autonomy, but surrender of armor. It requires allowing another person to see your fragility without defending against it. For someone whose entire identity is built around invulnerability, that surrender feels catastrophic. So they choose the illusion of connection instead of the risk of intimacy. But illusions do not nourish the soul. Sex can create closeness for a moment. It can create chemistry, intensity, attachment hormones, but without emotional openness, it does not build secure bonds. It becomes an experience rather than a relationship. And over time, a life built on experiences without depth begins to feel empty again, returning us to the cycle we have already explored. The path out is not through more conquest. It is not through stricter control. It is not through proving worth again and again. The path out is through vulnerability, the very thing most feared, because the truth is this: intimacy is not dangerous. Unhealed trauma makes it feel that way. Until someone learns that being known will not destroy them, they will continue choosing to be desired instead of understood. And being desired is never the same as being loved. As we continue to peel back the layers, another piece of this pattern comes into focus: impulsivity and thrill-seeking. When you look at repeated sexual encounters that seem reckless or indiscriminate, it's easy to frame them purely as moral failure. But psychologically, impulsivity often serves a regulatory function. It shifts internal states quickly. It overrides discomfort. It generates stimulation when the inner world feels flat or agitated. For many individuals with strong narcissistic traits, there is an underlying restlessness, a difficulty tolerating boredom, a discomfort with emotional stillness. When the external world slows down, internal noise becomes louder. Insecurity, shame, loneliness, unresolved grief. Impulsive behavior becomes a way to drown that noise out. Sex is particularly potent because it combines novelty, risk, validation, and physiological arousal. It activates dopamine pathways. It creates anticipation. It produces intensity. For someone whose baseline emotional state feels empty or unstable, that surge can feel like relief. There is also research and clinical observation, including work by Sam Vaknin, suggesting that narcissistic personalities often chase stimulation to maintain a sense of aliveness. The thrill is not incidental. It is central. Without excitement, they may feel deflated. Without novelty, they may feel invisible. So when we say a narcissist will sleep with anybody, sometimes what we're witnessing is not about attraction at all. It's about stimulation. It's about the adrenaline of pursuit, the excitement of secrecy, the rush of being desired in a new context. Even the risk of getting caught can intensify the experience. Risk heightens sensation, and heightened sensation temporarily overrides emotional discomfort. Impulsivity in this sense is not random, it is reactive. It often follows moments of ego injury, criticism, rejection, professional failure, aging, comparison to others. When the self-image cracks, the individual may urgently seek something to restore equilibrium. A new sexual conquest can function like a psychological reset button. You still have it. You're still desirable. You're still powerful. The relief is immediate. But here's the problem. Impulsivity bypasses reflection. It bypasses empathy. It bypasses long A, thinking. It prioritizes the present emotional state over relational consequences. And when someone repeatedly regulates themselves through impulsive acts, they never develop the internal capacity to sit with discomfort. Emotional maturity requires the ability to pause, to feel an urge and not immediately act on it, to experience shame without escaping it, to tolerate boredom without manufacturing chaos. But if early development did not model emotional regulation, if caregivers themselves were unpredictable, dysregulated, or inattentive, those skills may not have fully formed. So adulthood becomes a series of external attempts to manage internal states. You might notice that impulsive sexual behavior often intensifies during periods of stress. When life becomes uncertain, when identity feels threatened, when admiration decreases, the urgency for stimulation increases. It's not coincidental, it's compensatory. And because each impulsive act temporarily works, temporarily soothes, temporarily excites, temporarily validates, it reinforces itself neurologically. The brain learns, when I feel low, do this. Over time, the pattern becomes automatic, but what begins as stimulation can evolve into compulsion. Compulsion differs from desire. Desire is choice. Compulsion feels driven. It feels urgent. It feels like something inside is pushing you forward even when part of you knows there will be consequences. That inner pressure is often unprocessed emotion, and impulsivity does something else. It protects against introspection. When life is filled with constant stimulation, there is no space to examine the deeper questions, no space to confront vulnerability, no space to grieve unmet childhood needs. The thrill becomes a distraction from self-awareness. If you slow down, you might feel the emptiness. If you pause, you might notice the loneliness. If you stop chasing novelty, you might realize you don't know who you are without it. So you keep moving. The tragedy is that impulsivity erodes stability, and stability is precisely what the nervous system actually needs. Secure attachment, consistency, predictability. These are the foundations of psychological safety. But thrill-seeking undermines them. Relationships become volatile. Trust becomes fragile. Life becomes dramatic rather than grounded. And drama can feel alive, but it is exhausting. Another layer here is entitlement. Narcissistic traits often include the belief that one deserves special treatment. When entitlement merges with impulsivity, restraint weakens further. If I want it, I should have it. Immediate gratification becomes justified, but entitlement does not remove consequences. It only delays awareness of them. Partners are hurt, reputations suffer, internal shame deepens, and paradoxically, shame increases impulsivity, because shame is intolerable, and impulsivity offers escape. It becomes a loop. Now let's be clear, sexual desire in itself is healthy. Novelty can be exciting. Risk can be stimulating. The issue is not sexuality. The issue is when sexuality becomes the primary tool for emotional regulation. If every uncomfortable feeling is followed by a sexual distraction, then emotional growth stalls. You never learn to self-soothe internally. You never build resilience. You never develop the capacity to endure temporary discomfort. True strength is not in how intensely you can feel pleasure. It is in how steadily you can hold pain. Impulsivity masquerades as freedom. It says, I live by my impulses. I don't hold back. But unexamined impulses often indicate the opposite of freedom. They indicate being driven by unresolved wounds. Freedom is the ability to pause. And when someone cannot pause, they remain slave to their own internal turbulence. Healing would require slowing down the cycle, creating space between urge and action, developing awareness of triggers, learning to identify the emotional state that precedes the impulsive act. Is it boredom? Is it rejection? Is it shame? Is it loneliness? Without that awareness, behavior continues unconsciously. But with awareness, something shifts. The person begins to see that the thrill is not the solution. It is the symptom. Because stimulation can distract you from pain, it can never resolve it. And until someone learns to sit still long enough to face what they're running from, the chase will never end. And now we come to the final layer. The quiet belief that being desired is the same thing as being worthy. If you trace everything we've spoken about, the hunger for validation, the need for power, the escape from emptiness, the limited empathy, the avoidance of intimacy, the impulsive thrill-seeking, they all converge here. At the core is a distorted equation. If someone wants me, I matter. If someone desires me, I am valuable. If I can attract anyone at any time, then I must be enough. But notice how fragile that equation is. Because if worth depends on being desired, then worth fluctuates. It rises when someone looks at you with hunger. It falls when attention fades. It collapses when rejection appears. That is not stable self-esteem. That is conditional self-worth tied entirely to external response. When a child grows up without unconditional affirmation, when love is earned through performance, compliance, beauty, achievement, they internalize a message. I am lovable because of what I provide, not because of who I am. That belief does not disappear in adulthood. It simply shifts form. Sexual desirability becomes one of the most immediate ways to prove value. It's fast, it's tangible, it's visible. You can see the reaction in someone's eyes. You can feel it in their pursuit. You can measure it by how quickly they respond to your advances. In a world where internal worth feels uncertain, external desire feels like evidence. But it is the wrong kind of evidence, because desire is about attraction, not devotion. It is about chemistry, not character. It can be intense and still shallow. And if you build your identity on how intensely others want you, you are building on unstable ground. This is why one partner is rarely enough in this dynamic. It's not that the partner lacks beauty or devotion. It's that one source of desire cannot permanently stabilize fragile self-worth. The reassurance fades. Familiarity reduces intensity. The ego begins to doubt again. Am I still desirable? Do I still have it? And so the search begins again. A new person, a new spark, a new confirmation. This is not abundance. It is anxiety disguised as confidence. And here is the painful paradox. The more someone depends on external desire to feel worthy, the less they are able to experience secure love. Because secure love is steady. It is not always dramatic. It does not constantly spike adrenaline. It is warm, consistent, grounded. But to someone who equates intensity with value, steadiness can feel like indifference. They may interpret calm love as fading desire, and when the emotional high diminishes, they assume something is missing, when in fact what's missing is the chaos they've come to associate with worth. There is another layer here. Aging becomes terrifying in this framework. If worth equals desirability and desirability is tied to youth or novelty, then time feels like an enemy. Every wrinkle, every comparison, every younger rival becomes a threat to identity. That creates urgency. An urgency to prove, again and again, I am still wanted. And that urgency can drive behavior that looks reckless from the outside, but feels necessary on the inside. But no number of admirers can fix a broken equation, because the real wound is not about being unwanted. It is about not having internalized a sense of inherent value. In healthy development, a child learns that they are worthy even when they fail, even when they are not performing, even when they are quiet, messy, imperfect. That unconditional acceptance builds a stable core. Later in life, desire becomes enjoyable, not essential. But when that core was never fully formed, adulthood becomes a quest to build it through others' reactions. And here is where the confusion deepens. A narcissistic individual may genuinely believe they are confident. They may appear self-assured. They may even mock others for insecurity. But true confidence does not require constant reinforcement. It does not panic at the absence of attention. It does not crumble when admiration shifts elsewhere. If you must continuously prove your desirability to feel worthy, then your worth is not secure. This also explains why criticism feels so devastating in narcissistic structures. If worth depends on being admired, then disapproval feels annihilating. It is not just feedback. It is identity collapse. And when identity feels threatened, defensive behaviors escalate, including seeking new sources of admiration. So when we say a narcissist will sleep with anybody, what we are often seeing is someone desperately trying to maintain a fragile self-concept. They are not chasing pleasure. They are chasing reassurance. And reassurance obtained externally must be constantly renewed. The tragedy is that while they are busy collecting proof of desirability, they are missing opportunities to build internal worth. They are avoiding the deeper work of asking, who am I without the attention? Who am I without the performance? Who am I when no one is watching? Those questions are uncomfortable. They strip away illusion. They expose vulnerability. But they are the gateway to genuine self-esteem. Because real worth is not proven through conquest. It is cultivated through self-awareness. It is strengthened through accountability. It is deepened through authentic connection. When someone finally learns that being desired is not the same as being valued, that love is not measured by intensity but by presence, the entire pattern can shift. They may begin to tolerate the quiet of stable relationships. They may begin to sit with insecurity without immediately medicating it through attention. They may begin to understand that they are worthy not because someone wants them, but because they exist. And that realization is revolutionary. Because once worth is internal, desire becomes optional. And when desire is optional, it no longer controls you. So if we are to summarize this entire journey, from validation to power, from emptiness to empathy deficits, from impulsivity to intimacy avoidance, it all leads back to this fragile equation between desire and worth. Break that equation and the cycle weakens. Keep believing it, and the chase never ends. And the truth is simple, even if it is difficult to live. You cannot prove your worth in someone else's bed.